In this video, I want to start with a comment that Lazaris made about senseless violence, and talking about terror and terrorism and senseless violence in the culture. And the general connotation of the word senseless violence is that it makes no sense. And in its most literal sense, of course, this is not the case. Violence is an incredibly sensual activity, right? And so violence makes sense. It makes sensual phenomena occur. It is a sensual phenomena. And so, leaving that aside, is violence something that can be connected in a sane way to the progression towards sustainable well-being, right? So the question is, if we look at the data, are there situations where violence or the threat of violence or terror or the threat of terror have precipitated constructive change? Now, if we look to another arena of the Lazaris material, Lazaris talks about the dark and the light shadow, and in some of the more powerful alchemical meditations, Lazaris talks about the dark shadow, the drive, the fear, the hate, the anger. The dark shadow can be a force that propels us, that pushes us towards something. And that the light, the positive future, the dream, the motivation, the desire can compel us. So we have propel and compel, that the constrictive energies can propel us and the light energies can compel us. And that this is the optimal recipe for transformation, to move from one form or another. In other words, the fastest, most reliable way to move from one form, pattern of thinking, feeling, speaking, doing, and being, to another form, is to harness and align all of our constrictive energy and identity, and including the dark shadow, and all of the expansive and constructive energy, including the light shadow, and to align those so that the anger, the fear, etc., is pushing us, and the joy and the dream and the hope is pulling us. And that this is the most powerful recipe of transforming, moving from one form to another. And I noticed in the Thai temples that there, at the base of a number of the temples, were these animal humanoids. So they were half animal, half beast. And they were pushing upward. They were supporting the higher levels of the temple. And as you moved towards the higher levels of the temple, there were less and less of the animal beasts and animal humans, and more geometry, and more of the Buddhic expressions or the archetypes of peace, the archetypes of balance, the archetypes of justice, the archetypes of generosity. In other words, that the beast energy the animal energy, the instinct, the drive, that vitality was what these higher states rest upon. And in that sense, you cannot say that the 22nd floor is superior to the foundation that it rests upon, right? It makes no engineering sense to try and pretend that, a house is better than its foundation. The house may be more beautiful than the foundation, but a structural engineer will say that the most important beginning is the foundation. And, if you don't have that foundation, all the magnificent, whims of architectural beauty in the third floor can tumble down in the next rainstorm, right? That what is high without foundation falls. And so Lazaris appears to be, mildly schizophrenic, much like our culture, in terms of not condoning, that there's, or not acknowledging that there's any validity to violence. Validity meaning that it's not a path to evolution, while, still acknowledging in the shadow work, etc., that, the most powerful transforming energy is actually the dark shadow in partnership with the light shadow. And I want to suggest that this is the recipe in cultural transformation as well. If you go back to the 60s and look at racial tensions in the United States as perhaps the most relevant thing that we can all relate to, you can see that there's a continuum where, meaning America is less racist today than it was back then. Not by an enormous amount, but there have been large, at least legal and cultural movements in that direction. So there's a direction towards equality, towards integrity with the Constitution, and towards less racism. There's much less of a space in the United States today for someone to develop a platform on the basis of race, or to secure power on the basis of race, right? It's not looked positively upon even by racists in the political spectrum. People that may be secretly racist still don't think it's good form to build a platform on race today, and that wasn't the case in the 50s, right? And so, in the last 70 years, let's say that America has become 50% less racist, or maybe 70%, but it's made some progress. And if you look at the biographies and of the moments in history, I read the biography of Harry Belafonte, and I read the biography of Sidney Poitier, and just those two. And then if you read, Kennedy biographies, and if you look at some of the key biographies at the time, there are interesting points where this same dynamic is going on, right? Where Kennedy is basically needing Southern support, and the Southern support will only be given on the basis of racism, in a pretty clear sense. So there's a whole complexity of tensions going on, right? So Kennedy's sympathies are slightly like it'd be nice to have less racism, right? So that's there, but the real focus is on power, and and Kennedy is quite angry, at Black activists for forcing the issue by going into the South, right? And So, and there's an interesting moment where dogs attack children. I think it's in Selma. But there was a deep awareness in Martin Luther King and in the movement that unless they could capture police brutality on film, that it was not going to be that interesting to the American public. And the issue just, it wouldn't make papers. And people would just take the attitude, much as they did with the women's suffragists. It's like, oh gosh, troublemaking women, just put it under the carpet, right? But fortunately for the movement, there were some photographs that suggested that dogs were being set on people. And even though there's controversy about the photos, the idea, right? The idea of violence, the idea of public money being used to fund police forces that would be set on children that was a galvanizing point. So what I would say is that the cultural recipe for transformation is identical to the recipe that Lazaris outlines. And it goes something like this. Number one, there is the threat of riots, pain, there is an enormous threat of upheaval. And that is only generated by people being able and willing to be violent. So that's part of the recipe, right? So there is an extremist faction within, in this case, the Black community, but it doesn't matter. There's an extremist faction. In all of the changes that have happened, there is an extremist faction. And that faction has the position that we will burn down the system unless this changes, and we will die, we will be martyrs, we will loot, we will kill, we will do whatever it takes to get this changed, including sacrificing our own life. So that's the first part of the faction. And we could call that the shadow faction, because civilized people, and in this case, Lazaris is saying it's senseless violence. But of course, it isn't senseless. It's part of the alchemy. Now, the next part is you have the temperate members of the movement, which have zero clout without the extremists, right? So Martin Luther King has zero clout, except that in the transformation of a fear-based, shame-based, change-resistant cult or culture, that if a president has to deal with an issue because there's enough violence, there's enough uproar to make noise about it, that the president always prefers to deal with the more rational, the more reasonable members of the group. And so how it works is this loads the gun, right? The radicals load the gun by saying, we are going to detonate this bomb in this cult unless this changes. We've got nothing to lose. Then the moderates go to the power structure and say, look, we don't agree with blowing up shops and this and that and the other. We don't agree with that. But we are not going to be able to control our members unless you give us this, this, and this. And the power broker is in the middle, right? The power broker does not want to change and has strong backlash, right? The status quo, the people that are happy with the current system, do not want to change. And the power broker is really the balance, a politician in a democracy is balancing, right? And so it's the job of the extremists in a dynamic to create enough credible threat of disaster for all concerned that even those that don't want any change acknowledge that some change would be better than the disaster, right? Then the politician can say, I'm not doing the extreme thing. I'm dealing with the moderates. But come on, let's at least follow the Constitution. You say you're a Republican, you dumb fuck. All men are created equal, right? Hello. You say you're a member. You're all obsessed with the Constitution and the founding fathers. Hello, right? Could we have a little? Could you just follow your own dogma, please, right? And then not blow up the country. Is that too much to ask, that you actually pay any attention to your own Bible or your own? Is that too much? And of course it is, right? In fear-based, shame-based cults, they're not about sanity, etc. They're about fear of the unknown, change. I don't want this. What could happen here? It's being driven by trauma. It's not being driven by religion or anything else. I want things to stay the same because I'm scared of the unknown, because when I was young and out of control, I was severely traumatized, and I clung on to something that seemed stable, and now I don't want it to change, right? And so that's the conservative force, is really about blocking change, right? And progress, you have that force, which is about saying, hey, there's always a better place, let's change. And so you have the moderates then here that say, okay, let's give them equal rights, at least on paper, that consistent with the Constitution. And then you have the extreme racists, on the other side that say, no, I would rather die than treat an African American as an equal person. And they threaten to blow up bombs and all that. But the moderates say, well, if we don't go too far, if you'll balance it like this and deal with the moderates there, then we'll stop our guys from, blowing up the country. And then you'll stop your guys from blowing up the country. And then you have a combination of fear and credible threat produced by violence and the threat of violence. And in most cases, I read the biography of Harvey Milk in San Francisco. In most cases, for example, the Irish, Catholic police force in San Francisco routinely took bribes, beat up, arrested homosexuals right and left in the Castro, etc., for disturbing the peace. In other words, the police would go into the Castro, ask for bribes, and then if the bribes weren't given, they would say, okay, we're arresting you. And then if they resisted arrest, then they would be arrested for resisting arrest. And really, they were just carted off for being homosexuals. And there was a moment in the transformation of San Francisco when the homosexuals actually gathered at City Hall and burned police cars and threw rocks in and broke windows, etc. And the police were shocked. They're like, where are our docile homosexuals that we've been able to bully and intimidate? And when rallies started coming, and when the police realized they could be killed, and in some cases were severely beaten up by homosexuals, that was one point of change. But the other point of change was when Harvey Milk repeatedly got political power through superior campaigning. And it was clear that the power structure in California would swing in part because of homosexuals. So it was political fear and violence that turned a a victimized, terrorized, brutalized, targeted minority into actually, one of the state's powerhouses. And it was moderates like Harvey Milk that relied on extremists to get elected and to gain political power. And so now San Francisco has a tremendous amount of freedom for lesbian and homosexual marriage and various things along those lines. So what it took to overcome the Irish Catholic police violence was the homosexual extremists being willing to commit violence and show that they were able and willing to do so, being able to gather 10,000 people at a time to go on marches. And but the other thing that helped to change it was the murder of Harvey Milk, as well as the mayor, by Dan White, and the police cronyism and the awareness of the cover-up of the trial, and then the response to that. So there were a number of issues relating to extremist and violence that brought the issue into public awareness and that allowed the moderates to negotiate, relatively good terms. So the thing to understand about this formula is that without the extremists, the moderates have zero power. The power of the moderates is to be the lesser of two evils that the power structure must deal with in the transformation process. So the extremists are the first ingredients. The moderates must differentiate themselves from the extremists that they depend upon. So it's hypocrisy. Like when we say, oh, we're not advocating violence, that's not the backstory. The moderates are hoping against hope that there will be enough of a credible threat with violence that they will be given a chance to be heard and listened to, right? And the power structure requires extremists to provide enough credible threat to go to their moderates on the other side. The power structure has got to be able to go to its moderates over here and say, look, the moderates over there are doing all they can to hold back the mob. You're going to see your business crashed in. You're going to see headlines. The president may have to send in troops. If you don't stop abusing the law, so this is part of what's important in transformation, is we have a martyred minority, a victimized minority that is legitimately, being disenfranchised and abused, right? All men are created equal according to the Bible, but we are Christians and we're just going to ignore that. All men are created equal according to the Constitution, and we're using public money to abuse different races, right? So you have a condition of abuse and sick behavior that creates a situation where a minority of the most victimized people have nothing to lose. Nothing, right? You've dehumanized me. I'm in a reptilian state, right? I'm traumatized. I have no hope of being treated as a human being in this cult, in this system. And I have no loyalty to a fucked up system that is this hypocritical, that's this sick, that's this disgusting, right? You pretend to be Christians. And look at you, you fucked up assholes, right? You pretend to be law-abiding people. You can't even follow your own dumb fuck laws. You're hypocrites. You're full of shit. So my life isn't worth living. I'm in enormous pain, and you're full of shit. This creates the condition for radical behavior. Hey, Suicide bombs makes perfect sense in this state, right? So the cult colludes and collaborates to create this condition for a minority of people. A minority of people will always be radicalized in extreme injustice, in extreme hypocrisy and extreme cruelty. That creates a dehumanizing experience that triggers blood to the reptilian brain. Blood to the reptilian brain means fight, flight, or freeze. Well, when you can't run, there's nowhere to run, and freezing is not paying off. All you've got left is fight. And the most extreme is the suicide bomb, right? I am willing to have my life go up in smoke as long as I tear down this system. Now, Lazaris would say this is senseless. Well, Lazaris also says that God got us all that is everywhere. So who are these people that are not connected with God got us all that is, right? Is life senseless? This is part of life, right? Life has been functioning and cultures have been evolving by a dominant group oppressing a minority until a minority has nothing to lose and a certain minority of the minority becomes radicalized and violent. That is the first beginning of the cycle of change. Then the cult that is maintaining the status quo gets all upset about the change and turns desperately to voices that it has consistently ignored, which are the moderate voices, the pacifists, etc., that say, let's work together. God, please, we want to deal with you. We don't want to deal with these people blowing themselves up or, looting, right? Or, catching fire to things. But the only reason we're dealing with you is because we don't want to deal with this, right? And so the pivot point is fear. There's the fear of change that every traumatized culture has. There is the tendency to abuse minorities that every reptilian culture has. And that's a dominant theme throughout most power structures in history. But then there is a transformation point. As energy is stored up in resentment, in hate, in fear, and in dissociation that says, I could give a damn if I die. I just want to see some change. And I want some of this pain that has been dished out to me to go back. I want revenge. Now, Lazaris has pointed and done a good job of acknowledging that revenge is normal. It is an impulse that almost every human has at different points. And Lazaris has said that, seek revenge, but the greatest revenge is success, right? But you've got to transform. If you're gay and you're constantly in secrecy, right, it's hard to succeed, right? If you want an open relationship of dignity with your lover, what do, Lazaris, right? Well, you just don't be physical. Well, not very useful, right? What do you do here, right? Are there any places, are you supposed to all move somewhere? And if the place that you move, San Francisco, is the, if you're just being arrested for walking around, and we're supposed to live with that? Fuck that, right? Fuck that, Lazaris. Come down here, be gay, and deal with this, or stop preaching from a dislocated position, right? So the radicals have to demonstrate their ability to harm the majority in some way and the willingness to do so. Then the power goes to the moderates to avoid that catastrophe. Then the political person that can only get elected if there's a majority vote has to go to the moderates on the other side and say, could we give them at least what's according to the law? Could we do that? And then they have to then calm down their radicals and say, look, we're not giving, we're still going to be favorites. We're still going to have nepotism. We're still going to put the white people in the, the men and the Christians, and we're still going to give them, the biggest piece of the pie. but could we at least stop beating the minorities in the street for no reason? You got to give them that, or you're going to lose everything, right? And so that is the deal. That's the cycle, right? So that there you have a revolution. You have a complete cycle from abuse, radical disenfranchisement leading to radical willingness to sacrifice and commit harm, to empowering the moderates, to providing negotiating leverage for the politician that's just getting power by getting the most votes from being in the middle, who then is able to silence their radicals. And it doesn't happen all at once, right? 100 years ago, women did not have the right to vote and were considered fools for asking for it and troublemakers, right? They went through an entire cycle of being humiliated, violence, rape, shamed in the press. And now women have the right to vote, right? There was protest, there was beatings, there were spousal abuses, right? There were, slurs, there was a willingness to fight. And so Lazaris says senseless violence. But of course, violence is the most sensual thing that we have and has been a key ingredient in most of recorded history in positive change, right? Whether it's gay liberation for Jach, right? Good for Jach, right? But that rested on the San Francisco riots, right? Neither Jach nor Lazaris came up with a better plan, right? There may be one, but it's not demonstrated, right? The current trans movement, which is a current iteration of that, is doing not so much stoning and violence, etc., but there is social media assassination, right? The ability to cancel people in social media is the violence, right? In the information age, to cancel one's reputation is death, socially and financially. And the ability and willingness to cancel a variety of people's long careers is and it is radical, and it is absurd in its extremism, and it's fanatic, etc. But that gives the moderates within the movement the ability to say, hey, can we at least acknowledge that this is untenable, right? As long as you keep making someone's life untenable, where they'd rather die than deal with this fucked up cult in their response to feeling like a woman when I'm a man, or feeling, whatever it's going on, that this is a phenomena that's happening to our demographic. And some of our people are killing themselves, just like homosexuals in the 60s, right? And some of our people are miserable, and some of them are being fired. And this is a big deal, right? And it is going through the cycle of violence and demonstrating clout, moving to the moderates, who then are using the political, thing and dealing with their moderates, right? It can't go too far to the other extreme, or the politicians won't get elected. Can't go too far to the other extreme, or the corporation can't function. But it is a cycle, right? And violence is sensual and makes sense in a dynamic where the sociopathic element of every cult is run by fear. In this case, the fear of change, which correlates to the fear of the unknown. Right? Everyone fears the unknown in a traumatized cult. And that fear of the unknown creates the fear of change, which unleashes the unknown. And that fear of change leads to attacking what is new. And when the majority attacks the minority that is different, you get cruelty, you get sociopathic behavior, you get tremendous hostility and violence of the majority to the minority, to such a point that the minority's life is not worth living. At that point, there will be a collapse, a suicide in part of the demographic, and that will be a freeze or flight mode, because we're dealing in reptilian territory. Or there will be a fight mode, right? And when the fight becomes a bigger threat to the unknown than appeasement, that's when the majority responds. And that's the territory that our cult, whether you think of it as the Christian cult or the Western cult, that's the territory over the last few thousand years, right? And there are instances in groups and individuals where things change without all of that. But there are not many cult phenomena, right? There's been no major recognition of racism or sexism or any of that, or without violence. So if that's the only way that the cult defines its willingness to change, is the combination of visionary ideals with the willingness to burn down the system by the most marginalized victims of oppression, then that is how the cycle will continue. And it is exactly the cycle of change that Lazaris is advocating on a micro level. Like on an individual, you've got anger, you've got fear, use that to propel you to change. And then you've got hope and you've got ideals, use that to compel you to change. Okay, great. And then change occurs at an individual level, right? Well, at a group level, you've got the disenfranchised, you've got violence, you've got hurt, you've got pain, you've got outrage. And use that to compel you to change. And then you've got ideals that you're just paying lip service to, but can't be bothered to, actually, all people are doing this and that, the other, as we continue to bully the homeless and do this and that, the other, right? So it is the same recipe, right? So I think Lazaris is playing a politically correct game by talking about senseless violence. Obviously, it's not senseless. It's filled with senses. And obviously, it is a necessary part of the cycle of transformation in a fear-based, shame-based, largely sleeping reptilian cult where the majority has statistically treated its minorities like shit. Right? You go to any high school, what are the 5 handsomest, biggest guys doing in the high school? Statistically, some of what they're doing is bullying the dweebs, the smaller kids, right? What are the cool girls doing in the high school, right? Statistically, they're shaming and dissing people that can't defend themselves. What is the whole school doing? Ganging up on someone who's different, right? This isn't new, and it's not somehow changed, and it doesn't matter about the religion. They're doing it in Islam. They're doing it in Christian schools. They're doing it in our schools today. It's the majority attacking something that's different because it can and because there's an innate fear of the unknown, right? And some of that, some of those who have been viciously attacked again and again and again, reach a point of pain where they have nothing to lose. And then there is a violation of social norms as the only way to gain enough attention and to load the impetus to the moderates, right? The moderates have no power without that group able and willing to act, right? So in that sense, the Black Panthers gave the leadership position to Martin Luther King. Martin Luther King is the leader in the movement, but he would have zero attention without that awareness of the ability and willingness to use force, the ability and willingness to act in a way that destroys the oppressive system. And that is, frankly, the foundation of the United States, right? Lazaris talks positively about the United States, talks about senseless violence. You don't get a United States without violence, right? So, so that's irrational, in other words, right? For Lazaris to praise the leadership role of the United States for its positive traits while denigrating violence and terrorism. The United States, in many ways, is the largest terrorist actor on the planet today. And if you poll the globe, right? If you poll the globe as which country are you most frightened of, that's terror, right? The United States will rank high in a number of countries, right? And it might be among the highest, right? Now that number might rise if there was true awareness of all of our different CIA and other intelligence operatives. If we were all aware globally of the number of democracies that the United States had toppled, of the number of terrorist activities and militia that we'd armed, and the number of all that, that was really aware. The United States could be the number one terrorist since Germany, or at least it would be a tie with Russia, right? Because I don't think we've killed hundreds of millions of people the way the Russians have of their own people, right? But that's on a global scale, But we've also used violence and come out of violence. We didn't fight like the regular military. We fought like terrorists, hiding behind trees, leaving grenades, throwing out and hit and run, exactly what they did in Iraq. And that bought America independence. So is it senseless not to be slaves of the British today? Or is that a step forward, right? So I think it's important that we acknowledge data. Lazaris encourages thinking, good, right? But how about a little thinking, Lazaris? And I think it would be great if Lazaris did a tape on the constructive uses of violence throughout history, right? Because part of what's sick, part of what a lie is it's not an absolute distruth, it's a distortion, right? When you're sitting in a free country that was delivered out of violence and talking because you're free and able to think, right? You're not beheaded for talking, dirt about the Queen because you fought and you beat the Queen, right? That's why you have the ability to go to a Lazaris seminar, is because your ancestors were willing to be violent. Right? So the honest truth is, it's not that, there aren't better ways of doing things. There are. Wouldn't it be nice if people were empathic, right? And said, oh, you're a minority, let's welcome you to this school. Wouldn't that be nice? It would, right? So do it, right? That's not happening. It's not happening amongst Lazaris people. Like, wouldn't it be nice if when I or Terry Clancy or Barbara Brannon or whatever mention something that's not right with concept synergy, wouldn't it be nice if they said, you're right, let's do something about that? But they don't, right? And so as long as the reptilian brain, which is the fear-shame-based brain, is predominant in the cult, in the culture, whether it's the culture of business or the culture of relationships, the geopolitical culture of determining, as long as it's dominant, then fear is what speaks, right? And you won't get a change at Concept Synergy because a bunch of the employees asked for retirement benefits. They did, and Jach said no, right? You won't get change. You'll get change with a strike, with a protest, with we're going to do a full documentary on this issue unless this is resolved, right? If every Concept Synergy employee said that, we're going to all quit, and we're all going to do a documentary, and we're going to steal the email addresses. Oh, my goodness. It's against our principles, right? Change them, right? Do what works. Lazaris says all beliefs are false. Pick the ones that work, but this is against our principles, right? Well, if our ancestors had said that, we don't want to, we swore, we were sworn into service. This is the law of the land. Well, is it serving growth? Is it serving development, right? And of course, you have to be able to supplant an oppressive regime with something better. And many times it goes south, right? Many times the people most willing to overthrow and betray a bad regime do not have the character to create something better, right? And so that is a statistical reality, right? But it's worth, it just depends, it depends. Usually, if you can bring overwhelming force, that balances the fear on the other party's side of change, right? We are largely a fear-based culture because we're largely a traumatized culture, and traumatized cultures put most of the blood to the reptilian brain. And so we look through the eyes of threat and fear the unknown, right? So I think it would be more truthful, more honest of Lazaris to talk about the constructive role of violence today and throughout history, rather than to rest upon the fruits of violence. See, and it's not just the fruits of violence, it's the fruit of the threat of violence that then leads to a better peace. Nobody wants violence, right? It's just when you treat minorities so badly that the only way they feel like getting up in the morning is to destroy the structure that's humiliating them, right? The obsession with revenge, for example. That is, right, in Nemesis, in a variety of, that is actually an important force throughout history. Nemesis, and Lazaris has done a good tape on Nemesis and the righting the wrong. It's not about it's about righting the wrong. Whether it's an eye for an eye, that's righting the wrong, right? So it's, I think this completes the picture, meaning there's nothing that Lazaris is saying about techniques or whatever that I think should be deleted or called senseless, right? But neither is there anything about the way cultures have been growing and evolving that should be, artificially diminished, right? Every ingredient should be given its due, right? And the reality is that the threat of violence is the gunpowder that starts the chain reaction that has led to many of our healthiest changes and will continue to do so as long as a majority of its people, long as a majority of people on the planet today and in the future, are dealing with fear of survival and security, with fear of love and belonging based on scarcity, based on incompetence. Those conditions create sociopathic dynamics where the bigger bullies and takes an unfair share of the smaller one, right? The bigger one bullies the smaller one, whether it's countries, individuals, or groups. Right? Hitler would never have attacked the Jews if they were the majority. Right? 95% of Germany is Jews. Hitler is going to try and seize power by turning the 5% of non-Jews against the Jews. No. It's always scapegoat a minority. Right? And that minority gets scapegoated as long as it cooperates, right? And has to get some clout politically, financially, physically to stop that, right? Otherwise, it continues, right? And so I think that would be, I think a lot of people in the Lazaris community would be a lot more sane if they were not avoiding this data and were actually thinking it through, right? And then you'll have specific people in your life who at certain times will be empathic, will be transcendent, will be have a lot of character and be driven by ideals. These will not generally be highly traumatized people in need of scarcity, right? So it's going to be someone who's highly successful and transcended their reptilian nature through success and competence, right? But a lot of what brings people that way, to that point is sociopathic behavior, right? So the United States has transcended a lot of its reptilian behavior through success and competence. But it is still, if you look at its treatment of Edward Snowden or Julian Assange, we are reptiles through and cowards through and through. Right? Bullying, lies, deceit, attack on people bringing the truth, right? It's filled with lies, right? No different in concept synergy. We put up with it. And it would be nice if Lazaris acknowledged that side of the cycle, right? Because changes do not happen in a reptilian culture without fear of pain being one of the ingredients in the change. And we still, as far as I can tell, are in that domain 60% of the time.